Welcome to this week's OK at Work with myself, Sarah Sawyer, my colleague Russell Berger, both attorneys at Offit Kurman. And today we are talking about classification issues and whether employees are properly classified. So there are two different kind of categories of classification. There's independent contractors and employees. So sometimes folks are misclassified when it comes to those characterizations. And then within the employment space, we also have classifications of whether someone's exempt from overtime laws or they're not exempt. So definitely these are two areas where we see a lot of folks that are inadvertently misclassifying people, especially when it comes to 1099 employees, maybe around seasonal workers or holiday help. We're the holidays now, got this great tree in the frame here. And they said, when employers are looking to bring on some people to temporarily help with something, and they're like, oh, I'll just 1099 you. And we hear that a lot, like, oh, I just 1099 them. So what are some things that people should think about when it comes to whether they should be 1099ing people?
Yeah, so this is a great topic for this time of year, just because it's the kind of thing that as an employer, you'll continue to push off because it's not, it's working. There's no real issues. There's no real complaints. And this is a good thing to dedicate some bandwidth to, and that if you happen to have a quiet period at the end of the year, where you start kind of self-assessing and planning for next year. So to answer your question, Sarah, I mean, yeah, you've identified the two issues. Independent contractor misclassification is problematic on a couple levels, because if you do it wrong, the IRS or state unemployment or workers' comp or somebody may come after you looking for back contributions and interest and penalties. But also, if you misclassify a worker, they could come after you for not paying them properly, not paying them overtime because you called them an independent contractor and we don't pay them overtime. So there's all sorts of issues that come from that. And again, there are a number of different tests, depending as many laws as there are that use this distinction. There are that many different tests, and probably more because different states, different courts, different circuits in the federal system apply different versions of these tests. But what's really important is to understand whether or not, first off, to accept the fact that there's no such thing as a 1099 employee. That's just a made up term that's not real. So the first step is to determine whether or not the person's a 1099 independent contractor or a W-2 employee. And a lot of that has to do with the extent of control that the employer, the business, is exercising over the worker. And I always like to think of it as, like, on the one hand, there's the plumber who comes to my house and does repairs and shows up when they want to show up, doesn't take any of my direction on the work. Frankly, I couldn't give any direction on that kind of work, and gives me an estimate and then gives me a bill for the total project. I mean, that's a pure independent contractor. And then, the other end of that extreme is the person, is an administrative assistant that takes direction and works when the boss says they're supposed to work, and punches the clock and uses all the company's equipment and tools to get their job done. And then there's a whole range of stuff in between. So part of what we do is assess kind of where a worker might fall in that spectrum. And then once we make that assessment, we then also have to determine whether they're exempt or non-exempt with respect to overtime, which is another critical distinction, because if you get it wrong and you take someone who's really non-exempt and you call them exempt, then you're not going to pay them overtime, time and a half, and you get a big problem, especially the way the overtime laws add multiplier damages and fee shifting and all of that. And I guess the other, while I'm kind of rattling off things that don't really exist in employment law, the other one is the notion that, well, I paid them a salary, so they must be exempt. Paying an employee a salary is often a essential component of a worker being exempt, depending on the exemption that might apply. But it's not the be all end all. There's still a job duties test. So there's a lot of thought that has to go into this.
Yeah, it's a little bit, if it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. It's probably a duck when it comes to employees versus contractors. And I'll have a lot of clients who sometimes they'll classify someone as a contractor, but they essentially have an employment agreement with them. They're calling them an employee. They're treating them so much like an employee that it's just, they're saying, well, I called them an independent contractor over here, it says it's an independent contractor, but the document reads like an employment agreement. So, really it's just calling someone one, that's another, just kind of misconception. You said there's no 1099 employee. Well, there's no just choosing to call someone a contractor and it makes them a contractor. As you alluded to, there's a lot of tests here. So it's not just that I say it's so and it's so, or that individual, I hear this a lot too, that individual chose, they wanted to be a contractor. The individual we engaged for this, they asked to be a contractor. Well, that still doesn't mean they're not entitled to all the protections under the law as an employee, if they classify as an employee. And it doesn't mean that you still have to pay payroll taxes on them, because everyone would choose to do that and save the money if they could, right? So, so those are just kind of some misconceptions there, and just things to be watching out for when you're doing that. Because a lot of folks too in certain industries, well, there's a lot of misclassification, and in those industries, I'll also have clients that'll say, well, so and so's doing it, so want to make sure, there's a lot of misnomers here, a lot of things that, as we say, don't exist, that have been thrown around and colloquially used and things like that. So just something to keep in mind. Well, thanks, Russell. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sarah.